3 nights. No sleep. No answers. A powerful man who controlled half the city was on his knees, holding a broken plastic dinosaur, and begging God to bring his little boy back. But the person who would change everything wasn't a detective, a bodyguard, or a millionaire. It was a 7-year-old girl in worn flip-flops, and a scarred dog the world had once thrown away. Before we begin, if stories about hope, family, and the quiet heroes among us mean something to you, consider subscribing. Stories like this remind us what really matters. 72 hours earlier, the Marchetti mansion had fallen into silence. Benny Marchetti was 6 years old. Small for his age. Curly dark hair. A laugh that filled rooms. The kind of child who still drew houses with big smiling suns because he believed every home should be happy. And then he was gone. He had been playing in the backyard, a yard surrounded by high walls, cameras, and 12 armed guards. In less than 2 minutes, he vanished. No ransom call. No witnesses. No trace. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. His father, Nico Marchetti, was a man the city respected and feared. A self-made billionaire who ran a powerful business empire built on sharp decisions and an iron will. In boardrooms and backrooms alike, one quiet order from him could change lives overnight. But none of that power mattered now. Inside his private office, the walls were cracked where his fists had struck them. Furniture lay overturned. Coffee cups sat untouched, cold and bitter. Nico hadn't slept in 3 days. He sat at the long conference table, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. In his hand was a small green plastic dinosaur. Benny's favorite toy. Every night, the boy hugged it to fall asleep. Now Nico held it so tightly the plastic edges had cut into his palm. Around the table sat 20 of his top security men and investigators. Tough, experienced professionals. Men who had handled kidnappings, corporate threats, high-risk recoveries. But tonight, none of them spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. $5 million had been offered as a reward. Every private investigator in the region was searching. Street cameras had been reviewed. Phone records analyzed. Even rival groups had quietly joined the hunt. And still, nothing. For the first time in his life, Nico Marchetti looked powerless. He leaned forward, pressing the dinosaur to his forehead, his voice barely a whisper. "Where are you, buddy?" The room stayed silent. Because everyone there knew the truth no one wanted to say out loud. After 72 hours, the chances of finding a missing child alive dropped fast. Then a phone vibrated. It belonged to Carlo, Nico's chief of security. He glanced down, frowning, then looked up. "It's Father Michael," he said quietly. "From St. Andrew's Church." Nico didn't move. Carlo hesitated. "He says there's a child there. A little girl. She claims her dog can track Benny's scent." For a moment, no one reacted. Then one of the men let out a short breath. Another shook his head. A child. A dog. After 3 days of helicopters, specialists, and professional search teams. This was what they had come to? Carlo lowered his voice. "Father Michael says the girl insisted. She wouldn't leave. Said it was important." Nico slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, but clear. "Where?" he asked. "Church is open. They're waiting." There was no discussion. No debate. Because when you are a father who hasn't slept in 3 days, hope doesn't have to make sense. At 2 in the morning, Nico stepped inside the quiet church. The place was dim, lit only by candles and moonlight through stained glass. The air smelled of wax and old wood. And then he saw them. In the center aisle stood a thin little girl, maybe 7 years old. Her brown-red hair was messy, tied back loosely. She wore a faded t-shirt, shorts, and cheap flip-flops that looked too thin for the cold night. One small hand gripped the collar of a massive dog. The animal was enormous, at least 140 pounds. Gray, wrinkled skin, a long white scar across its muzzle. Heavy dark eyes that didn't look aggressive, just tired and watchful. The dog didn't move, and the girl didn't look away. She stared straight at Nico Marchetti, the powerful man the entire city feared, like he was just another worried parent. When he stepped closer, she spoke. "Are you Benny's dad?" Her voice was soft, steady. Nico knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Yes." The girl nodded once. "Let Goliath smell something that belongs to him," she said. "He'll find your son." Behind Nico, several of his men exchanged looks. But the girl didn't seem to notice. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply believed what she was saying. Nico studied her face. "Why are you so sure?" he asked. The girl didn't hesitate. "Yesterday," she said, "Goliath picked up a strange scent near the industrial gates. I saw a man carrying a little boy. He was crying." Her voice softened. "He sounded really scared." "I know that sound. I sounded like that once too." For a moment, the church felt very quiet. Then Nico reached into his coat pocket. His hand trembled as he pulled out a red knitted hat. Benny's. The wool was worn thin from 3 nights of twisting in his fingers. He handed it to the girl. And for the first time in 72 hours, Nico Marchetti felt something he had almost lost. Hope. The girl held the hat gently. Then she turned toward the back pew. Only then did Nico notice the woman sitting there. Thin, pale, maybe late 20s, wearing a faded gray hoodie. Sleeves pulled low over her hands, but not enough to hide the long scar across her wrist. Her eyes met his. Tired, guarded, but strong. And as the girl lifted the hat to the dog's nose, the woman spoke just one quiet sentence. "Josie is never wrong about Goliath." Outside, the night air was cold as they stepped onto the church steps. The girl knelt beside the dog. She held the red hat close to his nose, and whispered softly, "Goliath, find him." The dog's body stiffened. Its nostrils flared. Muscles tightened under its heavy skin. Then suddenly, it pulled hard toward the southeast, and Josie ran after him. Nico didn't hesitate. He ran too. And behind them, his entire security team followed, into the dark, toward a trail only a little girl and a scarred dog believed in. The leash went tight so fast it nearly pulled Josie off her feet. But she didn't let go. Her small hands locked around the worn strap as Goliath surged forward, nose low, body tense, moving with a purpose that didn't look trained. It looked instinctive, ancient, focused. Nico ran beside them, his breath already burning in his chest. Behind him, Carlo and 4 security men followed, their shoes slapping against the wet sidewalk, their eyes fixed on the strange sight ahead. A billionaire in a wrinkled suit. A little girl in cheap flip-flops. A scarred dog leading them through the sleeping city at 2 in the morning. Streetlights stretched their shadows long across the pavement. The air smelled like rain and cold concrete. No one spoke. Because there was only one question now. Was this hope or desperation? They ran for nearly 20 minutes. Goliath didn't slow. Every few blocks he paused, circling once, nose working hard, then locked onto a new direction and pulled again. Josie kept up, breathing hard but never complaining. Her flip-flops slapped against the ground with each step, the thin straps digging into her skin. Her mother ran close behind her, one hand always ready, eyes locked on her daughter. Nico noticed that. The way the woman never took her eyes off the girl. The way she ran even though she looked exhausted. The way her hoodie sleeves were pulled low, hiding old scars. That was a mother who had run before. Not tonight. Before. They turned down a sloping road that led toward the river. The smell hit them first. Mud. Algae. Stagnant water. Goliath lunged down the concrete embankment and stopped at the edge. His nose worked fast. Violently. Pulling in the air. Then he froze. He circled once. Then again. His head lifted. Dropped. Lifted again. His tail lowered. A short, confused howl broke the silence. The river had washed the scent away. Behind Nico, one of the men muttered under his breath. Another exhaled sharply. Carlo stepped closer, voice low. "Boss, this is where it ends. Water kills the trail." The words hung there, heavy, because everyone was thinking the same thing. This had been a long shot. Maybe a child and a dog couldn't do what professionals couldn't. Nico stood still, staring at the dark water. His hand slid into his pocket and closed around the plastic dinosaur. For the first time since leaving the church, fear crept back in. Not fear of danger. Fear of going home again to an empty room. But while the men waited for his decision, Josie moved. She dropped to her knees on the cold concrete beside Goliath. Her small hands cupped the dog's heavy head, pulling his face close to hers. She pressed her forehead against his. She whispered something. No one could hear the words. Then she pulled the red hat from her jacket and held it under his nose again. "Come on, buddy," she said softly. "He's still out there. Find him." Goliath inhaled. A long, deep breath that expanded his chest. Then he turned. Not toward the water. Along the riverbank. Slow at first. Nose low, skimming the edge where mud met concrete. Step by step. 50 yards. 100. 200. The men followed, though their steps were heavier now, doubt slowing them down. Nico didn't hesitate. If the dog was moving, he was moving. 300 yards down the bank, Goliath froze. His head snapped up. Ears forward. Body locked. Then he whipped left and charged into a narrow alley leading away from the river. Josie grabbed the leash and ran after him. The others followed, squeezing between brick walls and rusted metal fencing. Weak yellow light flickered overhead. Nico found himself running beside the girl's mother. Up close, he noticed the scar again on Goliath's muzzle. Long, deep. Healed badly. He spoke without looking at her. What happened to him? The woman kept running, eyes on her daughter. "My ex-husband," she said quietly. "He came at me with a broken bottle. Goliath stepped between us." Nico glanced at the dog ahead. "The dog didn't move," she continued, "even when the blood was running down his face. He just stood there and growled." She took a breath. "He saved us." Nico looked forward again. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a gamble anymore. This was a protector. They pushed through a broken gate and entered the South Industrial District. The city changed instantly. Abandoned warehouses. Rusted cranes. Weeds growing through cracked concrete. No streetlights. No movement. Just silence and moonlight. Goliath slowed but didn't stop. His body stayed tight, focused. Then Carlo grabbed Nico's arm. "Boss, listen," he said, breathing hard. "We're in the middle of nowhere. 4 men. No backup. We don't know who we're walking into. The main team is 15 minutes away." One of the men nodded. "We should wait." Nico didn't answer right away. He looked ahead. Josie stood about 10 yards away, holding the leash. Small. Thin. Flip-flops dark with sweat and dirt. She wasn't shaking. She was just waiting. Waiting for the adults to decide if they were brave enough to follow her. Nico turned back to Carlo. 72 hours, he said quietly. That's how long my son's been gone. He pointed toward the girl. She's the only one who hasn't said she's sorry. She said she'd find him. Carlo stared at him. Nico's voice dropped. I believe her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Carlo stepped back and checked his weapon. That was his answer. They moved forward. Goliath led them past rows of shipping containers and broken machinery until he stopped in front of a large warehouse. The metal door was old, but the lock on it was new. Goliath sat, looked up at Josie, and barked once. Sharp. Final. Nico stepped closer, staring at the building. Something cold spread through his chest, because he recognized it. Warehouse 7. Property controlled by someone he had trusted for 30 years. Someone Benny called family. Nico's jaw tightened. Cut the lock, he said. The metal snapped. The door rolled open slowly, screaming against its track. Darkness waited inside. Goliath walked straight in, nose to the ground, moving toward the back wall. Then he began to scratch. Hard. At a metal shelving unit. 2 men moved it aside. Behind it was a small steel door, and beneath it, concrete steps leading down into darkness. Nico stared at the opening. He knew what it was. Old smuggling tunnels. Sealed years ago. Or at least, they were supposed to be. He stepped onto the first stair. The air below smelled like mold, rust, and something else. Something human. Behind him, the others followed. Goliath went first. Josie right behind him. The tunnel stretched ahead, damp and narrow. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Then, about 50 yards in, the dog stopped. Carlo's flashlight dropped to the floor. A small juice box lay there. Dinosaur printed on the side. Next to it, a tiny sock. And on the wall, drawn in red crayon. A house. With a big smiling sun. Nico's knees gave out. He was here, he whispered. And Goliath lifted his head, already turning deeper into the darkness. Because the trail wasn't over yet. Goliath moved forward with quiet certainty, his claws clicking against the damp concrete as he disappeared deeper into the tunnel. Josie tightened her grip on the leash and followed without hesitation, her small steps careful but steady. Kira stayed close behind her daughter, one hand hovering near Josie's shoulder, ready to catch her if she slipped. Nico rose slowly from his knees and followed them, his eyes lingering for one last second on the crayon drawing. A house. A sun. Even down here, in the dark, his boy had drawn light. That thought hurt more than anything. The tunnel stretched forward, the air thick and heavy. Water ran down the walls in slow trails. The smell of damp concrete mixed with something else now. Something lived in. Goliath stopped again when the tunnel widened into a small open space. Carlo's flashlight swept across the floor. There were crumbs scattered near the wall. A torn wrapper. A cheese stick package. A plastic water bottle, half empty. Someone had fed a child here. Nico walked slowly to the wall where the crayon drawing was. He touched it again, this time pressing his fingers gently against the wax lines. They were still slightly soft. Recent. His voice broke, barely a whisper. He was scared, and he still drew the sun. Behind him, Josie watched quietly. She didn't say anything. She just reached down and rested her hand on Goliath's head. The dog's nose was already pointing forward again. He wasn't done. Goliath, she said softly. Let's keep going. The dog surged ahead. The tunnel narrowed after that, the ceiling lowering until the men had to hunch their shoulders. Only Josie and the dog moved comfortably, their smaller frames slipping easily through the tight space. The air changed again. Stronger now. A sharp, sour smell. Carlo muttered under his breath. Someone's been living down here. Nico didn't respond. He already knew what that meant. His son had been breathing this air. Sleeping here. Crying here. Every step forward tightened something inside his chest. The tunnel stretched another 50 yards before opening into a junction. 3 separate passages split ahead. Left, right, and straight. All equally dark. Goliath stopped in the center. For the first time since leaving the church, he hesitated. His nose moved left, then right, then forward again. He stepped toward the left passage, then backed away. Turned toward the right, paused, then pulled back again. His tail lowered slightly. Carlo lifted his flashlight and looked at Nico. "We split up," he said. 3 directions. Faster. 2 of the men nodded immediately. It was the logical move. But before anyone could take a step, Josie shook her head. No. The word was small, but firm. Everyone looked at her. She stepped forward until she stood between them and the tunnel. "Don't move," she said. Carlo frowned. "Kid, we don't have time." "You're confusing him," she said quietly. The tunnel went still. She pointed at the ground. "Your smells are everywhere. Shoes, sweat, cologne, smoke, all mixed together. He's trying to find Benny, but you keep spreading your scent over everything." No one spoke. Because she wasn't guessing. She was right. Josie knelt beside Goliath and wrapped her arms around his head. She pressed her cheek against his and whispered something no one else could hear. The dog's breathing slowed. His body relaxed. Kira stepped closer and placed her hand gently on Josie's back. Up close, she could feel it. Her daughter was trembling. "You don't have to keep going, sweetheart," Kira whispered. "You've done enough. Let them handle it from here." Josie didn't turn around. Her eyes stayed on the darkness ahead. Tears slid down her cheeks, catching the flashlight beam. "Benny's more scared than me," she said. Her voice shook, but every word was clear. "He's been down here longer. He doesn't have Goliath. He doesn't have his mom." She swallowed. "I'm not stopping." Kira closed her eyes for a moment. Then she removed her hand. Not because she didn't care. Because she understood. Goliath lifted his head. He inhaled deeply once. Then he turned. Straight toward the middle tunnel. This time there was no hesitation. His tail lifted. His ears came forward. And he pulled. Josie stood and ran after him. The others followed quickly, their footsteps echoing through the narrow passage. The tunnel grew tighter as they moved forward. The ceiling dropped lower. The air grew warmer, heavier. And the smell became unmistakable. Old urine. Spoiled food. Stale air trapped too long in a place no one should live. Nico felt his throat tighten. His son had been here. For 3 days. The dog's pace increased. No more searching. No more circling. The scent was strong now. Close. Very close. Then suddenly, Goliath stopped. Everyone froze behind him. The silence was thick enough to hear their own breathing. Then the dog's ears snapped upright. His head tilted slightly. He wasn't moving. He was listening. Josie leaned closer. "What is it, boy?" Goliath didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed forward into the darkness. And then, they heard it. Faint. Weak. Far down the tunnel. Crying. Not loud. Not screaming. Just small, exhausted sobs. The kind of crying that comes when a child has cried so long, he doesn't have the strength left to cry any louder. Nico didn't move. For a moment, his body simply refused. Then the sound came again. And this time, it broke him. "Benny!" he shouted. His voice crashed through the tunnel, echoing off the walls. "Benny, it's Dad. I'm here." The crying stopped. 1 second. 2. Then, from the darkness ahead, a small voice. Shaking. Afraid. But real. "Dad." The word echoed through the tunnel like something fragile. Something afraid to believe itself. "Dad." Nico's heart stopped. Then it slammed back to life so hard it hurt. "It's me," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Benny, I'm here. I'm coming, buddy." And then the crying changed. It wasn't the weak, empty sobbing they had heard before. It turned into desperate, loud crying, the sound of a child who had been holding on for too long and finally heard the one voice he thought he might never hear again. "Dad! Dad!" Nico didn't wait. He ran. He didn't wait for the flashlight. Didn't wait for the men. Didn't think about traps or danger or anything else. He ran straight into the darkness, his shoulders hitting the tunnel walls, his head scraping the low ceiling. Pain didn't register. Nothing did. Behind him, Goliath surged forward like a shadow of muscle and speed, claws hammering against the concrete. Josie let go of the leash without hesitation. Kira grabbed her hand, and they ran after them. Carlo and the others followed, their lights bouncing wildly across the narrow space. The tunnel ended at a steel door. Nico hit it with his shoulder. It didn't move. Locked. He pounded on it with both fists, his voice raw now. "Benny, I'm right here." On the other side, the crying grew louder. Carlo pushed him aside gently but firmly. "Step back, boss." He took 2 steps back, then drove his boot into the rusted hinge. Once. Metal groaned. Again. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. On the 3rd kick, the hinge snapped. The door flew inward with a heavy crash. Carlo went in first, gun raised, flashlight sweeping the small space. Then he stopped. Completely still. Nico pushed past him. And saw his son. The room was small. Concrete walls. No windows. Just a camping lantern on the floor casting weak yellow light. In the middle of the room sat Benny, curled on a thin mattress. His curls were tangled. His face streaked with dried tears and dirt. His clothes were clean but different from the ones he had disappeared in. For a moment, the boy didn't move. His swollen eyes stared at the doorway like he didn't trust what he was seeing. Then his mouth opened. No sound came out at first. Then, "Dad!" Nico dropped to his knees. He didn't rush forward. He didn't grab him. He just opened his arms and waited. Because he knew. After 3 days alone in the dark, the boy needed to come on his own. Benny hesitated for 1 heartbeat. Then he launched himself forward. His arms wrapped tight around Nico's neck. His legs locked around his waist. His whole small body pressed into him like he was trying to disappear inside his father's chest. And he sobbed. Hard. Violent, shaking sobs. "I was scared. I was so scared. I called you. I called you and you didn't come." Each word hit Nico like a blade. He held his son tighter, one hand cradling the back of his head. "I'm here," he whispered, his own voice breaking. "I'm here now, buddy. I'm right here." With his other hand, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small green dinosaur. Benny grabbed it instantly, clutching both the toy and his father at the same time, like letting go of either one might make this disappear. Nico pressed his face into his son's hair. And for the first time in years, he cried. Not quietly. Not holding it back. The kind of deep, shaking tears that come from fear finally breaking loose. Behind them, no one spoke. Even the men looked away. Because there are moments a father deserves privacy, even in a room full of witnesses. Then Benny lifted his head slightly. His eyes moved past Nico's shoulder. And widened. "Dad, That dog is huge. Nico let out a wet, broken laugh. Goliath stood a few feet away, watching carefully. His massive body still, his dark eyes calm. Benny reached out a small hand. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't step back. He simply lowered his head. Benny touched his nose, ran his fingers over the wrinkled skin, over the long white scar. Then Goliath gave his hand one slow, gentle lick. Benny laughed. A small sound at first, then a real one. The first true laugh in 3 days. Josie ran into the room and dropped down beside the mattress like she had known Benny forever. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "Goliath found you." Benny looked at her and nodded, still holding his father with one arm. "Thank you," he whispered. Across the doorway, Kira stood with her hand over her mouth. She was crying silently, not just for the boy, but for something deeper. For the sound of a child being found. For the moment she had never had when she was young. For the proof that sometimes, someone really does come back. But Nico wasn't looking at any of them. Because as his breathing steadied, his eyes slowly moved around the room. And what he saw made him freeze. There were supplies stacked neatly near the wall. Fresh milk cartons. Bottled water. Packages of the exact cookies Benny loved. A new dinosaur coloring book. A full box of crayons. A clean blanket. A brand new teddy bear, still smelling like the store. Someone had changed his clothes. Fed him. Taken care of him. This wasn't a prison. This was something else. Nico's eyes moved slowly across the room. And then he saw him. A man sitting against the far wall. Quiet. Still. Holding a children's comic book open in his hands. Salt and pepper hair. Heavy jaw. Eyes tired, but not afraid. Nico's voice came out low. Almost a whisper. "Frank." Frank didn't stand. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply closed the comic book slowly and set it beside him on the floor, like a man finishing a bedtime story. His eyes lifted to Nico. There was no panic in them. No anger. Just something heavy. Something tired. "I didn't hurt him," Frank said quietly. The words hung in the air. Nico didn't answer. He was still on his knees, Benny clinging to him, one small hand gripping the dinosaur, the other wrapped tight around his father's collar. Carlo stepped forward, gun raised. But Frank didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Nico. "Look at him," Frank continued. "He's fed. Clean. Not a scratch." Nico's jaw tightened. Behind him, Benny pressed his face deeper into his shoulder. "I read to him every night," Frank said. "Held him when he cried. Changed his clothes. Gave him milk before he slept." His voice didn't sound defensive. It sounded like he was explaining something important. Like he needed Nico to understand. Nico finally stood, still holding his son. Goliath shifted slightly, his massive body moving just enough to stay between Benny and the man against the wall. A low vibration rumbled deep in his chest, not a growl, not a threat, just a warning that he was watching. Frank noticed the dog, then looked back at Nico. "I never meant to scare him," he said. "That part, I'm sorry for." Silence filled the small room. Then Frank swallowed. "I did it because I couldn't watch you turn him into what your father turned you into." The words landed hard. Nico's eyes darkened. For a moment, the air felt tight. Because deep down, that was a wound Frank knew too well. Frank leaned his head back against the concrete wall. "I've been in your life 30 years, Nico. I watched you grow up. I watched your father teach you things no kid should see." He paused. "At 10 years old, you saw your first body." Nico didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both knew it was true. At 13, you held your first gun, Frank continued. At 16, you pulled the trigger. Benny shifted in Nico's arms, sensing the tension, though he didn't understand the words. Frank's voice softened. Benny's not like that. He draws houses. Smiling suns. He laughs easy. His eyes flickered toward the child. I couldn't watch him become this life. Carlo glanced at Nico, waiting. Waiting for the order. But Nico still didn't move. Frank kept talking. I had people ready near the northern border. New name. New school. Small town. No money. No power. Just a normal life. His voice cracked slightly for the first time. I was going to take him somewhere he could grow up without fear. Without guns. Without men who solve problems with violence. The room went quiet again. Because what Frank was saying wasn't madness. It was love. Twisted. Wrong. But love. Nico finally spoke. His voice was low. Cold. You kidnapped my son. Frank nodded once. Yes. You locked him underground for 3 days. Another nod. Yes. Benny's small fingers tightened in Nico's shirt. Nico's voice dropped even further. He cried for me. Frank's eyes lowered. For the first time, the weight of that truth showed on his face. I know. The silence stretched. Goliath's low rumble continued, steady and protective. Josie stood near the doorway, holding her mother's hand, watching everything with wide, quiet eyes. Nico took one slow step forward. Goliath shifted, then relaxed when he realized Nico was moving toward the child, not toward the man. You say you love him, Nico said. Frank looked up. I do. Nico's voice broke slightly, but he didn't stop. Then you should understand something. Another step. He's 6 years old. Another. He was taken from his home. Locked in the dark. Calling for his father, and no one came. Frank's shoulders sagged. Because there was no defense for that. Nico stopped a few feet away. You don't get to decide his life, he said quietly. You don't get to decide mine either. Frank closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, there was acceptance there. Not fear. Acceptance. If someone did that to your son, Nico continued, what would you do? Frank didn't hesitate. I'd do the same thing you're about to do. Carlo moved. In 2 steps, he was beside Frank, pulling him to his feet and securing his hands behind his back. Frank didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't look at the gun. He only looked at Benny one last time. I'm sorry, kid, he said softly. Benny didn't answer. He buried his face in Nico's shoulder. Nico didn't look back. His voice was calm. Take him. Carlo nodded and led Frank toward the tunnel. The others followed. The sound of their footsteps faded into the darkness. Soon, the room was quiet again. Just the weak lantern light, the smell of concrete, and a father holding his son. Nico slowly sank back to his knees. This time, not because he was broken. Because he wanted to be at Benny's level. He pulled back just enough to look at him. Hey, he said gently. Look at me. Benny's eyes were swollen and red, but he lifted his head. Nico brushed the boy's curls back from his forehead. I'm here now, he said softly. And I'm not going anywhere. Benny studied his face like he was memorizing it. Then he nodded once. Small. Serious. Like a child making sure this promise was real. Behind them, Josie stepped closer. She sat beside Benny on the mattress without asking. Goliath was worried about you, she said. Benny looked at the dog. The big gray head rested near his knee. Thank you, he whispered. Goliath's tail thumped once against the floor. Kira watched from the doorway, tears still running down her face. Not from fear. From something warmer. Because in that underground room, she was watching something she had never seen as a child. A parent who came back. A child who wasn't left behind. Nico looked around the small space one more time. The blanket. The food. The coloring book. The teddy bear. And then he looked at Josie. At her worn flip-flops. Her thin clothes. Her steady eyes. And for the first time, the contrast hit him clearly. His son had a mansion. Security. Money. Everything. And he had still almost lost him. This little girl had none of those things. And yet she had run through the night to save someone else's child. Nico held Benny closer. But his eyes stayed on Josie. Because something inside him had begun to change. And he didn't even understand it yet. Above them, faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel. Carlo's voice called down. "Boss, you're going to want to see this." Nico looked up, and something in Carlo's tone made his chest tighten again. Nico stood slowly, lifting Benny into his arms. The boy clung to him instantly, his face buried against his father's shoulder, one hand still wrapped around the plastic dinosaur, the other gripping the fabric of Nico's jacket like he was afraid the world might pull them apart again. "I've got you," Nico whispered. "I'm not letting go." Benny nodded against his neck, his small body still trembling, but the tight panic in his breathing had begun to soften. The sound of his father's voice was doing what no amount of food or blankets could do. It was bringing him back. Josie stepped back quietly to give them space. Goliath moved with her, staying close to the children, his eyes still alert, his body positioned like a quiet guard. Kira watched the moment from the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression gentle but heavy. She understood what it meant for a child to be held like that. Understood what safety looked like when it finally came. From the tunnel, Carlo's voice called again. "Boss." This time there was urgency in it. Nico took a breath, then turned toward the stairs. "Stay with them," he said quietly to Kira. She nodded without hesitation. Nico carried Benny up the narrow steps. The boy tightened his arms as the space grew darker and tighter, his breathing picking up again. "It's okay," Nico murmured. "We're going home." When they reached the top of the tunnel, the night air hit them, cold, fresh, open. Benny inhaled sharply, then buried his face back into Nico's shoulder. Carlo was standing near the open warehouse door, his face tense. Two of the men stood beside him, their flashlights pointed toward the concrete floor. Nico stepped closer. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then the light caught the dark stain. Blood. Not fresh. Dry. Dragged across the floor in a long smear leading toward the back of the warehouse. Nico's voice dropped. "Whose?" Carlo shook his head. "Not the kid's." There wasn't a scratch on him. He pointed toward the far wall. Another smear. Then another. A trail. Like someone had been injured, badly. Nico's stomach tightened. "Frank?" he asked. Carlo hesitated. "We didn't do that." The words were quiet. Careful. Because Carlo knew what that question really meant. If Frank hadn't been hurt by them, then someone else had been here. Recently. Nico looked down at the trail again. The blood led toward a side exit, an old metal door that hung slightly open. Cold air slipped through the gap. "How long ago?" Nico asked. Carlo crouched, touching the edge of the stain. "Hours. Maybe less." Nico's grip tightened around Benny. Because that meant one thing. Frank hadn't been working alone. Behind them, footsteps echoed from the tunnel. Kira emerged first, holding Josie's hand. Goliath followed close, his nose already lifting, catching the scent in the air. The dog's body stiffened. His head turned slowly toward the open side door. Josie felt it immediately. "Mom," she whispered. "He smells something." Goliath stepped forward, nose low, breathing deep. A low rumble built in his chest, not the calm protective sound from before. This one was sharper. Warning. Carlo looked at Nico. "We should call backup." Nico didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the door. Then he looked down at Benny. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide now, sensing the tension. Nico handed him gently to Kira. "Stay inside," he said. "Lock the main door behind you." Kira hesitated. "Is it safe?" Nico didn't lie. "I don't know." But she nodded anyway, pulling Benny close. Josie stepped beside her, one small hand resting on the boy's back in quiet comfort. Goliath didn't move with them. He stayed near Nico, waiting. Josie looked at him. "Go," she whispered softly. The dog stepped forward. Nico followed, with Carlo and the two men behind him. The side door opened into a narrow loading area behind the warehouse. Broken pallets, rusted equipment, shadows stretching long under a flickering security light. The blood trail continued across the concrete, then disappeared near a parked vehicle. An old delivery van. The back doors were open. Carlo signaled the men to spread out. Nico approached slowly. The inside of the van was empty, except for one thing. A phone, lying on the floor. The screen was cracked, but still glowing. Carlo picked it up carefully. A video was paused on the screen. He looked at Nico. "You should see this." Nico took the phone. He pressed play. The image shook for a second, then steadied. Frank appeared on the screen. He was standing in this same warehouse earlier that night. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two men. Nico didn't recognize them. Frank's voice came through the speaker, low and tense. "If you're watching this, Nico, it means something went wrong." The video flickered. "I wasn't the only one who wanted the boy out of your world." Nico's chest went cold. Frank glanced behind him before continuing. "There are people who think the only way to protect him is to make sure you never find him at all." The video cut to static. The screen went dark. No one spoke, because the meaning was clear. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It had almost been something much worse. Behind them, from inside the warehouse, a sound echoed. A small voice. "Dad." Nico turned instantly, and the fear in Benny's voice told him one thing. Whatever danger had been out here, it wasn't over yet. Nico turned and ran back inside the warehouse. The others followed close behind him, boots striking hard against the concrete. His heart was already racing again, fear crashing back into his chest before his mind could even understand why. Inside, the air felt tighter. Kira stood near the tunnel entrance, holding Benny close. Josie was beside them, her small hand wrapped around the boy's arm. Goliath had moved in front of them, his body low, his eyes fixed toward the open main door. The dog was growling now. Not loud. Not wild. Just a deep, steady warning that something was wrong. Carlo moved quickly to the doorway and looked out into the dark yard. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No engines. No voices. But the silence itself felt heavy. The kind of silence that comes after someone has already left. Nico stepped closer to Benny. "I'm here," he said softly. "You're safe." Benny nodded, but he didn't let go. "I heard something," the boy whispered. "Like a door and someone running." Carlo came back inside. "Side exit's clear," he said. "If they were here, they're gone." One of the men spoke quietly. They were watching, waiting to see if the kid made it out. Nico understood. Frank hadn't been the only one involved. But someone else had decided not to fight. Maybe the rescue had come too fast. Maybe the sight of armed men had changed their minds. Or maybe someone had realized that hurting a child wasn't worth the price. Goliath's growl slowly faded. His body relaxed. The danger had passed. But the truth stayed behind like a shadow. There had been people willing to use Benny as leverage. People who saw power instead of a child. Nico knelt in front of his son again. This time his voice was calm. Let's go home. Outside, the night felt different now. The cold air no longer carried fear. It carried relief. Benny stayed in his father's arms as they walked toward the waiting vehicles. His head rested against Nico's shoulder, his breathing finally slow and steady. Josie walked beside them, holding onto Goliath's collar. Kira stayed close, her eyes moving between her daughter and the boy, making sure both of them were all right. When they reached the cars, Nico stopped. He turned to Josie. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough for what she had done. "You saved my son," he said finally. Josie shook her head. "Goliath did." The dog's tail moved once, slow and quiet. Nico looked at Kira. "I don't know how to thank you." Kira's expression stayed calm, but her eyes were tired in a way that spoke of years, not days. "You already did," she said. Nico frowned slightly. "You listened to her," Kira said. "Most people don't listen to kids. Or to people like us." Her voice was gentle, but the words carried weight. People like us. The poor. The forgotten. The ones the world passed by. Nico looked down at Josie's worn flip-flops. At the faded clothes. At the quiet strength in the way she stood. Then he looked at his son, wrapped in a designer jacket that cost more than most families made in a month. And for the first time, the difference between their worlds didn't feel like distance. It felt like responsibility. Weeks passed. The investigation closed quietly. The men who had been involved disappeared from the city, choosing distance over consequences. Frank was gone too, his name no longer spoken. But the bigger change wasn't in the business world. It was in Nico. Benny didn't sleep alone anymore. Every night, Nico sat beside his bed until the boy fell asleep, the small green dinosaur tucked safely under his arm. And every Saturday morning, the black sedan didn't drive to an office. It drove to a small neighborhood on the edge of the city. To a modest home where a little girl waited on the front steps with a very large gray dog. At first, Josie had been shy. Benny wasn't. Children understand gratitude in simple ways. They played in the yard, drew pictures, built imaginary worlds where giant dogs were heroes and tunnels always led back to the light. Kira watched from the porch at first, cautious. She wasn't used to wealthy men showing up without an agenda. But Nico kept coming. No cameras. No guards. No business talk. Just coffee on the porch. Quiet conversations. Two parents watching their children laugh. One afternoon, as the kids ran across the yard with Goliath chasing slowly behind them, Nico said something he hadn't planned to say. "I grew up with everything," he said. "Money. Power. People who did whatever I asked." Kira listened without interrupting. "But no one ever taught me what mattered," he continued. "I had to lose my son to understand that." Kira looked toward the yard. Josie had fallen, laughing, with Goliath standing over her like a guard. "You didn't lose him," she said. Nico shook his head. "I almost lost the part of him that mattered." He paused. Then he added quietly, "Money can protect a house. But it can't protect a heart." That was the moment everything became clear. Because the real rescue hadn't just happened in a tunnel. It had happened in him. Months later, a new community center opened in Josie's neighborhood. After-school programs, counseling, scholarships, veterinary care for families who couldn't afford it. No press conference. No ribbon-cutting with cameras. Just a small plaque inside the building. Every child deserves someone who believes they are worth finding. The day it opened, Benny and Josie stood together in front of it. Goliath sat between them, older now, slower, but still watching over both. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Benny looked up at his father and asked, "Dad, why did they want to take me?" Nico knelt beside him. "Because some people think power matters more than people." Benny thought for a moment. Then he looked toward Josie and Goliath. "But they were wrong," he said. Nico nodded. "Yes." Then he added softly, the words settling deep in his own heart as he spoke them. "The strongest thing in this world isn't money or power. It's someone who refuses to give up on you." That night, back home, Benny fell asleep quickly. Nico stayed beside the bed for a long time, watching his son breathe. Then he took the small green dinosaur and set it carefully on the nightstand. Not because Benny needed it anymore, but because Nico did. Because it reminded him of the night a little girl in worn flip-flops stood in a church and said something the whole world had forgotten how to believe. Hope doesn't come from power. Sometimes it comes from the people the world almost overlooks, and sometimes the ones who have the least are the ones who save everything. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments which region you're watching from.